Leah, is it still echoey right now?
That seems better to me. It just, just side conversations. That's all. Can just be mindful. Thanks.
So good afternoon to everybody here in the room in Sweden, and welcome to everybody online in various continents, including the US, Europe, and Australia, where we've been told it's about 11:30 in the evening. So we're grateful for Leslie in particular for joining us. This, the last breakout session of this RDA meeting, all about chemistry, the central science. What a better place to be to end this meeting. I'm just going to say a few words about the goals of this session. And how do I go back? There we go. Okay, thank you. This session came together actually in Leiden. It was quite close to the RDA deadline. Met Felix for the first time from NFDI for Chem, and started talking about the challenge of describing chemistry data sets, because he's been charged with this task, because he's going to tell us about later, of a sort of general purpose chemistry data set. And that sowed the seed for an idea of this session to think about how we as a community can go about describing chemistry related data sets so that they go beyond just these sort of basic general metadata schemas that may tell you the bibliographic information and not much more, but have enough detail to be able to be reused across chemistry and chemistry related disciplines, support reuse and interoperability in both a chemistry and an interdisciplinary context. And what we want to, and I think have this in mind as we go through the sort of opening perspectives, what we want to get down to is a discussion about whether there are tangible cross-community goals we can address, particularly through RDA. There are shared notes. There's a bit.ly link there, which you might want to tap into. Please sign in there. You may find the link in the Hoover app to get there too. Note for people in the room, I think you're all paying attentive attention anyway, but there is another session just going on outside. So if you do have to leave or anything, just be conscious of the noise as you go. The way the session breaks down is roughly 5 minutes of introduction, 40 minutes of perspective, 40 minutes of discussions, 5 minutes wrap up. The perspectives are coming from a range of national initiatives, disciplinary initiatives, and IUPAC, who kind of obviously represent the sort of International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. And I'd like to express my gratitude to all of the speakers who have put time into preparing the slides and their presentations for what we're about to hear. It's going to be roughly 5 to 7 minutes for each presentation. I think I've tried to stress, let's keep them snappy so we do make sure that we have enough time for discussion at the end. With that, I think we go over to the first presentation, which is coming to us online from Jonas. And so Jonas, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for the nice introduction, and I hope you can hear me well. So in my presentation, I would like briefly to introduce the NFDI for Chem initiative and its efforts. NFDI for Chem is a project in one puzzle piece of an even larger infrastructure to be built called NFDI. And NFDI means National Research Data Infrastructure. It's a project in Germany for a broad range of scientific disciplines. The NFDI was initiated already in December 2018 by the German government as a self-organized and strictly science-driven project with the goal to make, as they call it, the research data as a high-quality data systematically available, nationally as well internationally networked and reusable for the entire scientific system. Next slide, please. So NFDI for Chem was from the very beginning and is still a grassroots movement growing along the scientific needs of our community. So the consortia is basically built on three equal important pillars. On the left-hand side, you can see the learned societies, like for example, the German Chemical Society. In the middle part, there are the information infrastructure institutions like the TIB, Karlsruhe or PDB. And on the right-hand side, the third but most important is a broad diversity of university as also non-university institutions, representing the scientific community and many subdisciplines in chemistry. And all together, so NFDI for Chem covers the whole spectrum from data producers to data users. Next slide, please. So we as a consortium, in order to maximize our impact, have decided to focus on molecular information. It means information about molecules, their properties, and analytical data, both experimental, but also in terms of computational simulations. Besides describing the research data sets with domain-independent core metadata, like, for example, DataSite, we already initiated the development of minimum information standards for major fields in chemistry towards more domain-specific metadata. And broadening the perspective, we will include contextual data and metadata from experimental descriptions, roles of molecules, for example, as edux, reactants, or products. So we not only aim to describe data in a human-readable form, but also in a machine-readable way by applying controlled vocabularies, terminologies, and ontologies to semantically annotate the data. Next slide, please. But the status quo in chemistry is, that much data is still managed in an analog way, sometimes literally written in a paper lab notebook with a pen. Of course, data is also generated digitally by analytical instruments like NMR, spectrometers, on LC-MS machines, and so on. But the most unfortunate aspect is the way we actually publish our data in scientific journals. Their chemical data is often published as PDF or even worse, a scan or a photograph of the data that was originally rich in information. But when this data is published as a PDF or Word document, this information is destroyed. One click, please. And this process or behavior is far away from the fair data principle. Going to the next slide. I will tell a little bit about our vision. So the vision of NFDI for chemistry is fundamental different and will be a quantum leap over the status quo. Our goal is nothing less than the complete digitization of all important steps of chemical research based on open and uniform standards, specifically tailored to the needs of our community. And therefore, we would like to start at the earliest possible stage, namely the actual data generation in the lab. And we want to support the researchers in data processing and analysis up to the final publication, as well as drive these comprehensive networking of all these database processes. On the next slide, you can, you can hopefully see the strategy of NFDI for Chem, which is quite well summarized, I think. So our strategy culminates in thematic areas, focus which represents both activities and services to be developed. All essential building blocks here for digitization workflows are linked to the smart lab, providing important components, services, and interfaces. And of course, consideration and involvement of the community, for example, via workshops, is just as crucial here as cross-TA collaboration within NFDI for Chem itself, and of course, international networking. because only when all areas interact smoothly, a seamless data flow can be achieved. Next slide, please. So starting from the experimental data in the lab, we will capture the information in electronic lab notebooks, short ELN, in a semantically rich form, and together with data from, for example, instruments kept in a laboratory information management systems to enable the data analysis locally. From there, fair and enriched data will be flowing into local repositories and later into public repositories, adhering to open standards so they can be reused by everybody in the world, and then trigger a new cycle of operative science. Next slide. And so coming to the end of my short introduction presentation, I would like to take this opportunity for a little bit self-promoting and draw your attention to two important events taking place in 2023. On the one hand, we have our Chemistry Data Days in Mainz, which will take place at the beginning of June, and community event. And on the other hand, I would like to announce the second ontology workshop in mid-October, which will be follow up on the topics of the first ontology workshop from 2022. And for this event, we are currently still in the consideration phase and therefore very, very happy about any ideas and input from interested stakeholders. And in case you missed the first one, I have linked the recording of the first workshop in the slides here. Yeah, and last slide, please. So last but not least, a few more resources which might be interesting for you. And with this, I guess I will hand over to Felix or Christian, which will provide a more detailed look into our NFDI for Chem repository universe. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I will entertain any quick questions that are specific to NFDI for Chem. If anybody has one, I do. And I just wondered if there was anything you could say about how NFDI for Chem might be interacting with adjacent NFDI for initiatives where chemistry may not be the core, but is relevant.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question? I have a little bit internet connection problems.
That's okay. I wondered if you could say a little bit about how NFDI for Chem was interacting with other NFDI initiatives which might involve chemistry.
Yeah, so nowadays you cannot draw any more sharp borderlines between what is chemistry, what is biochemistry, what is biology, physics, catalysis, and so on. And therefore, NFDI at all has, let's say, built-in mechanisms like section works, which are laying across different consortia. So we can work there on overarching topics or cross-cutting topics like metadata and so on, so that interconnection between all the different consortia across scientific disciplines is ensured.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to Felix.
Yes, thanks, Johannes, for the introduction of NFDI for Chem as a whole. I am, sorry, let's stay here. So I'm Felix Bach, based in Karlsruhe, Germany, where I work at FITS Karlsruhe, which is an infrastructure organization. It's a Leibniz Institute for research, basically. I had the research data department there, and I'm also one of the co-spokespersons of NFDI for Chem, where I lead the task area repositories. And in that task area, we chose several relevant repositories that form, let's call it a federation of interconnected services that agree upon our standards. And we develop these services further according to the needs of our community, which is basically the international chemistry community, because NFDI's funding is limited for Germany or is focused on Germany, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't collect the needs of the whole community. And additionally, to these core repositories that you see the logos here on the slide, there are several associated databases and repositories like this CSD, CCDC, and ICSD that collect crystal structure information. There are also generic repositories like Radar and Zenodo and EUDAT that include chemistry data sets. And there are lots of other relevant repositories and databases that include relevant data or that have functionality that plays a role. And chemists have asked us recently very often where they should deposit which kinds of data, which is a question that's not so easy to answer, but we tried with this slide here, with this graphic that you will also find in the NFDI for Chem knowledge base. So our answer is that it depends on the data types and the data formats where which data should go. But of course, there are complex use cases, complex data sets that need to be distributed across the several repositories. And the question is how to do that. Here I show an example, NMR data. And we propose that data are always collected in an early step of the research data cycle in the lab directly in an electronic lab notebook, short ELN. And we propose the Chemotion ELN because it is open source software and it includes a lot of functionality that's useful for chemists. And this makes it easy to collect the data already in a structured form together with metadata, which makes it then again easy to transfer the data to a repository in the same structure without having much additional effort. And yes, from the Chemotion ELN, NMR data can be copied over to the Chemotion repository where it can be published, it gets a DOI, so it can be cited and so on. But there may be parts of the data set that can go into specialized repositories, for example, here, NMArchive, that has then again more functionality. So you are able to collect more metadata there. And this repository will allow things like data analysis and machine learning based on the data collected there. And there may be other parts of the data set that may be raw data, for example, or some additional data that does not fit in the focus of these specialized repositories. And these data can then go into the catch-all repository Radar for Chem that we have set up for the NFDI for Chem that collects everything that does not fit into other repositories of chemistry. And to be able to realize these complex workflows and also to automate as many steps as possible, we need defined interfaces between all these interconnected services. And one is obviously the connection between the ELN and the repositories, also between the repositories to exchange data. We want to connect the terminology service. So we talk about the same things when we use the terms, we mean the same concepts. We also want to connect archiving services so that the data can be preserved over long time periods and will not get lost. And also we need mechanisms for metadata harvesting, so we can set up a centralized search on top of all that, where chemists can search for chemistry-specific terms. And to realize all that, we need some ingredients to set up such a federation of services. And I think the most important one is that the services trust each other, that they talk to each other and exchange, so everybody knows of the concepts that the other services are using. They need to agree upon standards for metadata formats, for the data formats, agree upon the terms that are used in the metadata, and agree upon APIs. And they need to provide interfaces for metadata harvesting. So we are proposing the rather old way of doing it, OAI PMH, to realize the central search. But of course, there are now interesting new concepts like data visiting and so on. And we try to foster them wherever we can, but we cannot do that in every existing service quickly. So we are just starting in Radar for Chem for now. Yes, I already mentioned the interfaces for data exchange as well, wherever we need them. Yes, and that's basically it. And I'm very interested in other use cases. So if you have any complex chemistry data set that should be distributed across repositories, please get in touch with us and let us know, or if you have complex use cases, and we will try our best to integrate them.
Thank you very much. I really like what you said there about trust as sort of like being that kind of focal point for how we maybe think about how we collaborate together. Any quick questions for Felix before we hand over to the next talk? And part of that trust is standards, and the next part of this talk is going to talk about both standards for sharing chemical data in the sort of NFDI for context, and it's going to be a joint presentation from Stefan here and Leah online.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. Leah is online, and we will dynamically try to switch talking between the slides. We didn't try that out before, so let's see how it works. Leah, would you like to start off?
Sure, this is a collaborative, just collaboration in action here with our talk. So I'm Leah McEwen, and I'm from Cornell University, but I'm wearing my IUPAC hat here, IUPAC International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, where I am currently the chair of IUPAC's Committee on Cheminformatics Data Standards and Publications. Stefan, I don't know if you want to, you're from NFDI. Okay, we'll just move on. Ooh, lovely formatting here. I think this slide deck went off and on different platforms quite a lot. So here we are, interoperability in action. So I think we can all agree that chemistry, there's a really broad interest in having chemistry data to reuse and across a lot of different domains and for a lot of different timely use cases. And to meet those requirements, they really do need to be very well defined, and they need to be ripe for sharing. Lots of important information needs to be associated with these data to meet the needs for all these different use cases and across sectors and over time. So the data need to be reliable in terms of both the sample information and the measurements, including identity of substances, full sample descriptions, measurements, techniques, conditions, calibrations. The results need to be interpretable via scientific expression. And then once we get through all of that, then we need to, we are in this room now talking about different approaches for how to format these for machines so that they can be fully interoperable at a pretty rich level of meaning to support further inference and analysis. And then finally, we really need to be mindful about how and where we expose this metadata so that we can do more of that federated searching and interlinking that Felix was just talking about across different repositories and online resources. So to support all of this, we want to enable standard definitions that are in practice in the community and facilitate their use throughout this whole process. So over to you, Stefan.
Okay, and when you try to define and do a standard, then what we found is that you need a number of ingredients, and that we've seen across a number of standards. So basically, you start that you want to have some guidelines or an article targeting to be human readable, being used in training, giving some background and rationale for things. Then you would also like to have a kind of checklist, for example, for author guidelines. So that would be the abbreviated form, just the what to do. then you would like to have somehow the data model fleshed out, aiming at programmers that want to use interface and implement that. This could be boxes with errors and some names of attributes in it. What we see increasingly, and what is a good thing, is to also put in ontology terms. So you have a controlled vocabulary that is independent of the standard being XML, JSON, or whatever, so that you can link to actual concepts and use them, reuse them in the standard, so you know what people are talking about. And then any standard development needs to come very early on with prototypes, reference implementations. That could be a database implementing that schema, or an electronic lab notebook that is capturing the information required in the standard, or it could be the repositories that are serving that kind of data. Leah.
Great. So as a standards union and in chemistry, IUPAC has over a century of defining kind of the parameters and core definitions of the fundamental concepts in chemistry that chemists and others use to describe the data and the measurements and the models that are used in chemistry. So we have a collective corpus of knowledge described in those standards over a century, thousands and thousands of pages of description. Those are mostly in analog format, and you can read them. They're all open access. But we're working now to try to implement these in more digestible forms so that they can flow into a lot of these implementable standards and data sharing initiatives that we've already been hearing about today. So we are in the process in IUPAC of trying to bring these forward and exposing more of these core definitions out through various mechanisms here, including our terminologies and nomenclature, and a few born digital file metadata schema. These are meant to be adopted and adapted and reused as needed by different use cases in the community. So we've heard a little from NFDA for Chem about how they're approaching their data models and their infrastructure, and we'll be hearing from other groups. And we in IUPAC would like to make this available. And so we're really appreciative to have a lot of feedback from this community about what they need that we could bring forward more to support their use cases. Stefan?
Thank you. Leah coined the term where rubber meets the road. Actually, it's a bit older term, but the fun and the beautiful thing about that NFDI for Chem initiative is that we are trying to bring things together. It's not all developed in one place, so the people have to be interoperable to make it work in the end. And examples are that the electronic lab notebook, ELN, thanks for answering the question in the chat. This is already using the terms from the terminology from the ontologies in the metadata fields people can fill in. It is using and exporting and converting the standard data format. So if people come with vendor formats, you'll get a JCamp out of that. We have seen how Chemotion is planned then to move the data to the repositories, for example, the NM archive. In NM archive, we are trying to be compliant with the FAIR spec from IUPAC. We also have the ISA data model somewhere in the background. And again, we are using the terminology that is in the ontologies defined. And the metadata term came up already. And that is something that you don't want. Can you go back to the mic? Sorry. Thanks for reminding. And the metadata has been mentioned a few times in the past, and you don't want to do that at the end of your data to position thing, because you want to carry that along all the way from the electronic lab notebook, so it ends up in, for example, the bioschema or schema.org metadata being transported in established metadata formats and then harvested from OAI services that are already used in the publication and data site fields a lot. So one of the efforts to also get the standards out there was the collaboration with journals and publishers. So the journal guidelines, the author guidelines are what the researchers are reading and trying to hopefully comply with. And we were looking at a large number of these author guidelines, and that's what the colorful wheel to the right is. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly corners of the author guidelines, where you see a lot of green means that is mentioned and recommended or even required by the journals. Some generic attributes are there, then yeah, there is a wake, you should deposit the data, also covered by many. But when you try to get specific, like what to do about the NMR data, then there is little mentioning of anything. It's better for crystallography. But then if you look at the upper left part of the circle, when it's machine readable chemical structures like SMILES or DNG, then things really fall apart. So that would be a state we are trying to address as well in a series of Editors for Chem workshop series. Do we have any journal people on board here? If so, please meet me, save the date, November 2nd for the next series. And Leah, over to you.
Great, thanks, Stefan. So as Stefan was just saying, there isn't a lot of encouragement for use of standards in reporting these data. And I think we all agree that's really important, especially to facilitate the transfer of metadata through the whole process. And especially if I think still the vast majority of our community is not kind of plugged into these instrument to repository workflows yet. So we will be seeing a lot of the data hopefully coming through this pipeline through journals. So I'm really excited about this collaboration that we have around this workshop series. And another way we're trying to support NFDI for Chem and other initiatives is to get our terminologies feeding into the ontology services. And I know there were already other sessions around this, and I'll be talking a little bit more about IUPAC terms later. So we're excited to be collaborating, and we hope there's other opportunities for IUPAC to support the community. Thanks.
Thank you both, Stefan. Thank you, Leah. Any quick questions before we move on? I think, oh, yes, go, Stuart.
You mentioned standards, metadata. Are you aware about the IADOPT ontology as a bridge ontology to describe observations also with chemical substances? And I think it might be of interest for you to look what we have done here and to collaborate.
I heard about it, and I haven't touched it myself yet. So that'll be something to look into.
And just to note that IUPAC is part of the Welfare Chemistry project that's working with a lot of domains. And that project is also looking at IADOPT and other models for cross-disciplinary interoperability. So yes, we are looking at IADOPT. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll keep it moving. We've heard a lot there about how what's going on in Germany and how that's linking into wider IUPAC initiatives. We're now going to hear about PSDI, which has probably been emerging since we last had a chemistry research data interest group meeting, which was probably some time ago. So new kid on the block. Yes, Brian, welcome.
Yes, we are still definitely very emerging. So yes, this is new stuff, a new initiative we're trying to set up in the UK called Physical Data Infrastructure. So I'm Brian Matthews. I'm from SCSC Scientific Computing and part of a team at Scientific Computing who are leading this, Juan, Vasily, myself and Barbara, but also in close collaboration with the University of Southampton, Simon Coles, Jeremy Frey and Nicola Knight, who are leading this initiative, though as you'll see, we hope this will eventually be a much broader initiative involving further institutions. So what are we trying to do? Is that forward arrow going to work?
Big button in the middle of that.
Oh, okay, the forward arrow didn't work. Okay. Right. So our aims, better use of physical science data by physical sciences. We mean we want to focus on areas like chemistry, materials, those areas. We're not looking at kind of fundamental physics, particle physics areas, but we're very much looking at the kind of the atom upwards into engineering potentially. That gap. Where we feel that there is, certainly in the UK, a lack of a systematic infrastructure to support this area. so we feel that we want to be able to fill that gap to encourage researchers in an area to aggregate data of different sources, make that data accessible, reusable, like fair, integrate experiment data from across different sources, from experiments, simulations, theory, and also importantly reference collection data collections, so quality data collections for access and reuse. And then use that data to support workflows in different sources at scale, into data analytics and machine learning, and then maintain and curate all that information over the long term. And we kind of want this to span across a number of different sort of institutions. Now, this is kind of very quite UK focused, but particularly sort of large scale institutions and research hubs, including national facilities, smaller national facilities centered around particular instruments or techniques like NMR or X-ray crystallography or various other ones there. Very importantly, computational initiatives. There's a lot of they're called CCPs in the UK where we have groups looking at particular software packages and software simulation software in particular areas, and we want to make sure that's involved. And then the long sort of the groups that are in researchers and universities. So we want to cover as much of this whole landscape as we can. Right, so where are we now? Well, we're kind of leading on this because we've kind of come out of a couple of previous initiatives that we've been involved with, Chemical Database Service and the Physical Science Data Science Service, which have been providing access to reference data in the UK. But we feel that we want to expand this out much, have a vision of expanding this out much wider. So we put it together, what's called a statement of need a couple of years ago now. Gathered quite a lot of community support to do this. The community said, yes, it's a great idea. We ran a pilot over the winter of 21-22, where we engaged with a lot of stakeholders and ran some small case studies just to gain some more requirements. And now we're in a second phase, phase 1B, had a small break where we're kind of beginning to expand out on this. So this is why we're quite a new project, and hopefully after the end of this phase, we'll move into the next phase and gradually expand up again. And we're currently developing plans for that next phase. So I won't go through these. So the pilot phase had a large number of case studies as well as a lot of community engagement. I won't go through these here. There is a report available on that. I will mention, though, the findings of these. There are 12 major sort of recommendations that's come out of that pilot. Again, I won't go through all in detail, but they're kind of into three kind of separate groups. So the first four are around the landscape, where we are now and what we might do with the landscape. You know, we're quite a fragmented landscape, pockets of excellence in different places, but not particularly well connected. We benefit from connecting those existing resources rather than trying to build new ones, and to give that better connectivity and use of new technology to drive that. The next set of 4 or 5 recommendations are about what kind of services and tools might be put into the PSDI. So looking at more support for workflows, better support for data curation, through allowing researchers to do that research without their data management. And so that's catered for them. And then using that data to take it forward, to support data to knowledge, and support the whole tools for data collections across that life cycle. Strangely enough, we have in another presentation a life cycle diagram very similar to the NFDI one, where we want to cover that whole life cycle. And the final 3 are about community. So we want to do this with a community consensus. It's about data integration, about tools, about standards, about metadata, rather than necessarily about putting big lumps of hardware in. And then promoting the best practice, promoting skills to use this, and of course, international collaboration, open standards, organizations like RDA. We want to collaborate with you on these things, and also in the international contexts, both Europe, and we've seen particularly in Germany, NFDI is an important initiative with quite very similar aims, but also US, Australia. We heard about one from Japan earlier today. So a huge range of people who want to collaborate internationally. So where are we now? Well, we've gone to a next phase where we're kind of beginning to prototype a platform, doing more requirements analysis and starting to design a platform, trying out different bits of technology. And we've set up 5 what we call pathfinders, so more detailed case studies to explore particular aspects in particular areas. And there's 5 of those, I'll go back actually. Yeah. So this is so to that end, we've kind of sketched out a rough architecture of the kind of things we want to produce, and we're now looking at technology options to fill out all these different boxes. And then pathfinders. So 5 pathfinders. First one in catalysis. So the next talk, which we're going to hear, fits very well because that's discussing the catalysis pathfinder and what that is trying to do around experimental data capture, as well on process recording, focusing around workflows, electronic notebooks, and again the metadata required for those. There's a case study around building data repositories and data collections, which is focusing on spectroscopy. And then the last 2 are more about the kind of the use of data. So the first one is around simulation data, environmental sciences, and workflows there. And the second one is around machine learning on atomic potentials. I think, and then I think this is my last slide. And then we're kind of building the hub, what the public hub is going to do, governance and coordination, management, starting to develop core infrastructure components, which will either be kind of in one place, but it also would foresee this would be federated across a number of different institutions as well. And then looking at what standards will we need to support to encourage to make all this stuff work. So looking at the vocabularies, ontologies, how we interpret FAIR and how we gain interoperability. So I think that's all I have to say, and sort of more detail on a case study, one of the pathfinders in the next talk. Thank you, Brian.
Any quick questions? So I've got one for you to think about, Brian. I think that's sort of with the pathfinders you've got underway, are there any in particular which might be ripe for this sort of international collaboration? So I'll let you think on that as we move on. And we go online, as Brian was saying, we're going to hear about from the UK Catalysis Hub and from Abraham, who's involved in one of these pathfinders. So Abraham, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking about distributed chemistry and data objects and why these are important for the UK Catalysis Hub and how we are approaching this. So it gives a bit of context and shows what we're doing for the Pathfinder. Next slide, please. So we can recognize the activities of the research data lifecycle is very similar to the ones we've seen before. Next slide, please. But in the context of the Catalysis Hub, we have to acknowledge that this is not something that we can, one single institution can drive. It's a collaborative effort. Next slide, please. So to make sense of this complex picture, what we are proposing is the creation of a specific thematic portals. And in this case, we are the thematic portal for the Catalysis Hub, which would connect to the PSDI, but also to other repositories which exist and will continue to exist alongside PSDI. Next slide, please. So one of the proposals is adopting a semantic object model to describe the data and to try to facilitate the reuse, publication, and further exploitation of data. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, we think that having data in context is very important. That isolated data is not useful. We have to acknowledge also the comparison of techniques. So most of the papers will have at least 2 techniques, when not 4 or more techniques like spectroscopy, chromatography, density functional theory, etc. So but we think that the minimum required is the data which supports a paper should be enough to reproduce the results. Next slide, please. So it's more than just the data. The semantic model is also supporting the mapping of published results to the supporting data. And using this model, it should be possible to follow the provenance chains back and forth and reproduce an experiment. The next slide, please. For instance, this paper, which is stored in the catalysis data infrastructure, has some data associated with it. Next slide. So if we look at the paper, we see that there is 7 types of experiments, and the results are presented in tables and figures, both in the main document and in the supplementary information file. And the most interesting one are contained in 2 zip files and 1 description file. Next slide, please. If you keep zooming in, you can see the results, for instance, of the X-ray spectroscopy results, which are presented in tables and figures, and which relate to 224 files in one of the compressed zip files. Next slide, please. If we keep zooming in, for instance, if we focus on one of the graphs, we can say that this figure 4 is linked to this data, and we have some details on the metadata about how to identify the related data. Next slide, please. And if we download the data from the repository, which is Southampton in this case, we can start trying to reproduce the results. Next slide, please. So in this case, we are zooming out and we identify, for instance, this tin oxide and tin and platinum composites and how they were presented. And these are the results, and these are the steps that we took to reproduce the results using the data provided, which is both in the Nexus file format, which is part of the output formats from the bin line, and also in ASCII format, and now also in intermediate format. Next slide, please. So the full look of this workflow is something like this, and using this metadata model, we should be able to find linked data objects, track the provenance, map published data to results, reproduce results manually, and automate reproduction using workflow packages. Next slide, please. So what made this possible is the existence of already linked data. We use Crossref, we use the Scholex Explorer. We also take advantage of the existing repositories. For this experiment, we use the repository on Southampton, the CCDC, but also Materials Project and Springer Materials. We also take advantage of open formats, which can be read by more than one software package. So, for instance, the Nexus format and XDI. We have also taken an advantage of the published metadata, even if it is in Word format, and the existence of open source software to reproduce these results. Next slide, please. Not everything was as easy as we are telling you now. For instance, the source data is not linked from the paper. We had to go into the Scholex at least, and that's the way we went out to find the data. So some of the crystallographic information was not mentioned directly in the paper, so we had to go and take our best guess with the existing crystallographic repositories. And metadata is only in human readable form, which is not ideal. So next slide, please. The further development as part of the PSDI, we want to make this into a correct representation in an ontology. We are looking at Reproduce Me, which is from Germany, I think, this ontology. And we are looking at other ontologies used to represent everything and make it an automated process. Next slide, please. So in the ideal scenario, we would like to see automatic mappings, publishing of data in open formats, creating services which can allow us to reproduce this. We are currently working with the scientific computing department for a Galaxy workflow component for XAS reproducibility of experiments, and creating workflows which can be reused, and making this an example which our scientists would like to use maybe more in the future. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abraham. I'm going to keep us moving. I think Abraham demonstrated that fantastically the complexity of one single data set. And also looked at how we can go so far with the things we've got and some of the gaps are over. We've sort of gone from molecular focus to a more physical chemistry focus, and now we're gonna go right around the world and probably out into space and even more diversity, I'm sure.
The big one is for advancing. Yeah, I think I've taken a much more pragmatic approach here in showing what our concerns are. Geochemistry is in many ways way far behind in what has already happened in chemistry with respect to standardization. And so we are at a stage to really look at the basic interoperability standards that we need just within our domain. What I'm presenting here is efforts of this One Geochemistry initiative, which is an international effort to at least bring different facilities, repositories, communities together to speak a common language in geochemistry. And we are part of the World Fair project, and in that respect, working closer with chemistry, with nanomaterials on what is really what are the commonalities in this. So I wanted to give you a bit of a feeling what geochemistry is, because I'm not sure everybody here is familiar. We are at the intersection of analytical chemistry and geology, or earth sciences, planetary sciences as well. Geochemists analyze natural materials, primarily, in some cases, experimentally created materials that sort of clone natural materials, and analyze the whole periodic table, the composition, what is in rocks, in minerals, in sediments, and water, with respect to trace elements, major components, but also the whole isotopic chart with radiogenic, with stable isotope ratios, and so on. And what the goal is to identify chemical or isotopic characteristics of these materials that tell us a lot about the processes that have happened in the Earth, on the surface, interior, in the creation of the solar system. So it's a wide range of applications. And when geochemists look for data, they do this to compare their own results with what's out there in the literature already, in order to understand patterns primarily. And, you know, as data volumes grow, we have seen a change in geochemistry, where initially there is a comparison, or this is my data in this region or for this particular topic, what have others found, to now take the vast volumes of data and really create something that we now call statistical geochemistry, that tells you of broader patterns, of longer term patterns, and so on. And on the right side, by the way, those are images or graphics that Leslie Wyburn created in her career as a geochemist, famous huge compilations of data. And this is one of the important aspects, I think, of what One Geochemistry is doing. as people need these large compilations of data, we need to be interoperable because the resources of geochemical data are so fragmented. So just to give you a feeling of what are the ways a geochemist actually tries to find data, it's mainly about the samples on which they worked. So it's the sample characteristics such as the location, the age, the geological environment or context, the scientific questions that you work on, that's what you want to look for. But in some cases, it's also looking for, has anybody analyzed manganese isotopes on this and so on. And that's where vocabularies come into play. And then the usual questions of in which lab, have data been generated, but also analytical methods. And we have hundreds of methods that constantly change. And this is one of the big challenges. What do we require for reuse? Obviously, a lot of provenance information, which method, which sample preparation, how have data been manipulated, normalized to other standards and so on to eliminate lab biases. We need information about uncertainties, about the data quality, and we need a consistent reporting of data to integrate. Units are still different in the literature. So we need the interoperability among systems. And so these are some of the initial steps that we're taking. We need standard location metadata in order to integrate geospatially, or not only within geochemistry, but with other data types that are out in the geological sciences. If you want to compare to seismic data, you need location information that matches. Again, geological context, material properties. So we often query by mineral species, by rock species, and so on. The chemical properties needs standard analyte names and analyte representations. Units, obviously, standard date formats, especially for time series data that is being created. And then with respect to provenance, the use of persistent identifiers. And this is particularly relevant for samples. And that's why sort of this effort of creating persistent identifiers for samples has come out of the geosciences because it's so critical. So the biggest challenges for us, as I mentioned, is the big fragmentation of all the data resources. They are partly national, partly institutional, programmatic, topical by certain data types. There are databases just of oxygen isotope data and so on. So across everything, there are local standards, what I call local, community-wise, or national or institutional, and a lack of tools to actually integrate and manage these. So these were just my answers to the questions. Yes, we want to work through the RDA. We will participate in working groups that will come up, hopefully, and will help craft a case statement. Thanks.
I think that theme of fragmentation has definitely been coming up. Barbara, you've got a quick question, if we can insert it.
You mentioned hundreds of methods. Are some of them already fair, machine readable descriptions or not? And do you have any idea which standard you want to use?
That's actually interesting. I mean, none of these methods is really machine readable, but I now see, as I'm sitting here, I see overlaps in the methods. So natural materials get analyzed with synchrotron. Spectral data is there, and I'm actually just working for cosmochemical data from asteroids, how I'm going to store the spectral data. And I want to talk to people who do already know about standards for spectral data. So there is nothing really that is machine readable. And what we did, we started talking to instrument manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, in order to get a little more consistency in the way people report the data that come out of their machines. Yeah, I know.
Thanks. A comment and a quick question. Kirsten, that was excellent. I really, really enjoyed that. I thought that was very insightful. In particular, what got me very excited was that list, that checklist of requirements for interoperability. That's exactly what we, in an ideal world, every domain should be creating that checklist. And that goes beyond what's in FIPS or what's in FAIR, for example, because those are the connectors that you need. And this is something we've been talking about in World Fair in the cross-domain interoperability framework. So that really sparked with me, because I think that's what we want each of the World Fair case studies to do, and other groups to do as well. That what do we actually need in order to combine our data? Because sometimes these conversations rest on a far too theoretical or abstract level. So that was fantastic. I've got a question which maybe I'll throw out there, because it's also for the previous speaker, and I'm sure that Leah wants to get on. You mentioned provenance a number of times, but in our sort of thinking about provenance, you were talking about provenance strictly, so the origin, and things that are in Provo, and processing information. And I'd be really interested for a discussion with the previous speaker as well, as how are you capturing that? And how are you modeling that processing information as well? Not just the provenance, the creation, but the processing, how the data has been processed, normalized, subsetted, etc. Because that's something that we can learn a lot about across domains as well.
Yeah, just to answer to that, I mean, this part of that information is already been captured by different data systems in a tabular way, in a numerical way, but a lot is just in method documentations that are textual, that are sitting in papers. And what we're starting to do is really creating method directories that help researchers store information about their processing in repositories, so they can reuse it and attach it to different data files or data sets.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on quickly to Leah, who's just going to run through some of the things that IUPAC has that can help us now. Leah, I'm here ready to advance your slides at whatever pace you would like. And if you're speaking, we cannot hear.
Yep, got it. Yep, go ahead and advance the next slide. I've already introduced myself. Just briefly to summarize, where IUPAC sees its role here. I mean, we have some data resources, but mostly we are not a data repository. We're not, actually a facility in that same way, but we are defining the parameters for describing chemistry. And so I think our role here is to ensure that as the data is shared, that it's actually interpretable at a chemical level, getting down into a little bit more details about what's in that metadata and how it's structured. And a lot of these things have come forward in the previous talks. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, IUPAC's been developing a lot of standards around how to describe chemical data and information for a really long time. And, primarily these have been, human readable oriented definitions. So we're in a process now in IUPAC to move, kind of transfer these over, morph these over into more machine processable forms. And you can see that in the lower half of the slide. We have some various machine readable notations for chemicals and chemical structures, and terminology for describing chemical processes, chemical methods, chemical descriptors for different types of chemical materials. So lots of rich descriptive information there. One thing, well, I guess we'll go on. I think it's easier to look at them. Just really briefly, because I know we want to get on to the discussion. I'm delighted it's kind of already started. So probably most of you are familiar with some of the notations that IUPAC have developed here, including the systematic name, and this is very systematic, so it is a useful for categorizing and classifying chemicals. And then the INCHI chemical identifier, which is really critical for matching the identification of chemicals across different data sets and databases. These are focused on organic chemistry, as you're seeing here, but there's work in progress to develop some of these notations in other areas of chemistry as well. Next slide, please. Just really want to emphasize, importance of describing chemical data. So IUPAC, in addition to the terminology and the nomenclature, also compiles from the reported literature, reported measurement data for chemical properties, and compiles these, and then does some pretty rigorous critical evaluation on these, and publishes recommended values for these properties. And the intention is for these to be used in high precision modeling. So we are already kind of a use case for reusable data in that sense. And so, like, for example, you can see in the middle of the slide that the data that's reported back for isotopic abundances via the periodic table. And as you can see in that slide, uncertainty and precision is really important for us, but there's not necessarily a consistent way of expressing that depending on the method that was used for computing that uncertainty and how to express it. So that's one thing we're working on in IUPAC, is to enable a more useful definition of how to describe that uncertainty in a machine processable way. And I think that's something I want to emphasize here. So we're trying to get more of these data sets that are high value out to the community to reuse as reference data sets and modeling data sets and training sets, but also to learn through our need to describe these precisely, what's really important for describing chemical data so that you can compile it and reusing it. And then sharing back these metadata parameters back to the community as you're all building your infrastructure. Carry on. Next slide. And just lastly, we also have the chemical terminology that I mentioned. I think many of you are probably familiar with the Gold Book, those terms. That's a compilation of the terms that have been defined in IUPAC around chemistry. There's over 7,000 terms in there now. We've been a little bit behind in keeping that resource up to date. So we're in the middle of a content update that should probably add in several thousand more. Those terms are accessible now through an API, and we're in the middle of developing more enriched metadata for those. So as you're pulling them out, parse through the meaning more rigorously. And also we're hoping to set up a suggested term pipeline for the community to let us know what additional information they need. And then finally, we are involved in the World Fair project, along with several other case studies. And so our goal here in this project is to enable support the reuse of standards. So for example, one of the areas we're working on is a protocol for specification for API protocols for exchanging chemical data at the high level. So we're hoping to sort of build a coordinated effort for common fields in APIs, for example. So we have two prototypes. These are very demo level prototypes of where we're hoping to go with our protocol services and our trading cookbook. That's it.
Thank you, Leah. So the discussion, as Leah said, has sort of started a bit, but I think, we've got about 20 minutes now to sort of zoom in, I think, on thinking whether there's ideas of something that we could take into a further conversation of a group within RDA. And I think what I'd ask the various people who've presented and anyone else in the room to think of, what's that medium-sized sort of thing where coming together and thinking about it, whether it be a checklist for interoperability or reuse or reproducibility discovery or something like that, that might make a good cross-community conversation. While you're just thinking about that, Abraham, I just wondered if you wanted to respond to Simon's sort of question about whether you had started to give thoughts to how you're going to capture that process information that's so key to provenance.
Yes, I was talking about this reproduce me ontology. It's an extension of probe O and plan A. They combine these two ontologies and they create reproduce me, and it can be used to model the whole a workflow or a Jupyter notebook or whatever, and you can very easily model this an experiment from end to end. So this in combination with the RO-Crate, the research model from the another of the working groups in RDA, which is the Fair Digital Objects group. So we are trying to combine those two for both representing the complex data sets, which are not which composite data sets, and also how these composite data sets can be used at least to reproduce results. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. In the room then, what could we all do next? And if online you've got something you want to say, if you can interact with the Zoom controls, then please do. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. In the ERC project Panos and Expanse, we have created a search API for photon and neutron data, and I'd say almost all facilities that participated are implementing this search API or about to implement it. And there's a big void in the search API. There is a tag for a sample, but we don't know what to put there really. And I think that's a key thing for you to search our data. So I think we'll be very happy to have some indication what to put here. It's a JSON serialization. This API gives the information back in JSON. So yeah, I don't know, maybe we need to some categories and some keywords. There's this inches, this small thing, and the cars, and I don't know, whatever we can put there. Would be great to have some help here, what to put in our repositories, and then what to expose to the outside in this API.
I think that's a really interesting thought, actually, because I think in my experience of the conversations that take place in chemistry, the sample is somewhat neglected and could be an interesting starting point. And I wonder if Kirsten's got something to say about samples.
When it comes to samples, I'm always there. I think it would be really important to participate in this. We have an interest group in RDA on physical samples, and it's specifically meant to be, cross-disciplinary. So learning more about chemistry samples. Chemistry has, I mean, you've been in the sessions, but creating a metadata profile for samples for that particular community would be a really great step to do. And that's again where we could see which metadata for your samples are actually similar to metadata in other communities. Where do we need a common language and a common structure? So that would be my suggestion, is to start working with some group on defining the specifications of a sample profile in chemistry.
Excellent, thank you. Any other comments on samples before I move to a comment in the chat? Or, Felix, you've got your mic.
Yeah, not especially to samples, but in general regarding a centralized search, I would strongly encourage to view that from the perspective of a chemist who's searching something. So what would a chemist search? Yeah. That's the question for me. And we don't really know these use cases in detail yet. And maybe first we should collect these use cases to see what are they searching, what do they want to get back, in which form to find relevant data sets. Yeah, and then we can think about how to represent that, and I'm really interested in that search API, so maybe we should get in touch.
Yep, that sounds interesting. Brian, you raised your hand there. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah. It's almost, I was, I've been thinking echoes more or less all that. I mean, what are the broader the number of, we want to be able to link together as many of these databases as we can, but the broader the scope, the simpler your common bit has to be, really. So what is that? I hesitate to say minimum metadata because that kind of that takes us down a whole different thing, and maybe you can get too broad. But for what is a sufficiently detailed but sufficiently broad minimum metadata, just about a profile you're talking about, would we do to support so we can interop between different databases or different data repositories? And what are the entry points as well? I mean, sample is an entry point, chemical name is an entry point. What are that's what are the use cases for the queries that people are, for the minimum queries that people want to do it. So yeah, that would be a really interesting thing to explore.
All right, that's great. I think Leah's maybe summarized some of these use cases for searching diverse use cases across chemistry disciplines and other domains. And I think maybe if we do make a concerted effort to capture these together, thinking about those starting points when we put them together, we'll understand how common we can make these sort of metadata profiles to cut all across chemistry, or maybe there's a limit to that. Maybe sometimes you do just have to drop into the sort of more specialized areas, but I think we don't know the answer. And so a good way to start is understand what researchers want to do. There was a comment in the chat here from Stephen Richard, and this is thinking about recommendations for vocabularies to categorize analytical technique, instrument type, analytes, etc. I guess what sort of kind of resonated there for me is it's another sort of intersection to another activity in RDA around PID-INST and all that sort of thing as to how should chemistry be interacting with that. Does anyone in the room want to make any comments on sort of like the analytical technique and instrument piece of this? At the back, Alex.
I guess that boils down to the provenance question, really, where you enable a data user basically to validate the quality of the data set. And I think that brings us really to looking at the data producer and the data user. They're probably quite different type of people. The data producer is such an expert that they know what they're doing, and they find it a known, yeah, I use this machine every day and I reduce the data this way, so why would I put that provenance data in there if I'm such an expert and I'm in that same community? So I think it's really yeah, nice thing to focus on, because we basically use the same instruments. We put different samples in there, we prepare these samples different, and we do different reduction on the data perhaps, but we use similar instruments to get data, to analyze samples, and so describing them in a good way and the method that goes along with getting the data be a really good start.
Okay, thank you. We got a couple of hands up online, then I'll come to Gerhard in the room. Leah?
Go ahead and let Stefan go first.
Okay. Who was it? Stephen Richard.
Oh, hi, thanks. Yeah, I just would like to add, I mean, I think there's two levels to this question with the vocabularies. On the one hand, as far as the machine interoperability and the ontologies and processing things with computers, you need precise language. And in a lot of cases, as you build these vocabularies, when you want to build a logically coherent and consistent vocabulary for machine applications, you end up having to create classes and labels that don't necessarily correspond well with the usage that the practitioners are using. And so there's at one level, you have this machine interoperable vocabulary that's formal and structured and logically coherent. On the other hand, when you present this to the users, you need to have labels that the users are used to seeing. So there's a user interface level and there's the machine interoperable level. And I think a lot of times in these discussions, we get tangled up because there's a lot of discussion about the labels we use in interfaces for interacting with users as opposed to the logical constructs that we need for interoperability. And you really need to separate those two things and recognize that we have this logical vocabulary that we want to construct. And then when we build user interfaces, we need to provide labels that mean something to the community that that user interface is targeted for. And so I think that, if you recognize that distinction, it makes it a little bit easier to work on these kind of interoperable vocabularies.
Thank you. Leah, did you want to add to that?
I was going to say something different, but I actually agree. I think that is really important because we do need both of these things, right? And I think that actually reinforces what Alex and others were saying too before, is that the data generator and the data reuser may be very different. In fact, actually, the data reusers may be a lot of different data reusers, and so I think that maybe understanding that the reuse contexts and then where the data came from and the provenance around that might help bridge understanding if that data can be reused in some of these reuse cases. So in addition to the labels, I think also the fitness for use is another bridge that we need to build between the data source, that how the data got to be and whoever's needing to reuse that, if that data is appropriate in their context. So that was a little, but I had something else I wanted to say, but I'll wait if you want to get others.
Yeah, okay, I'll go to Gerhard here, who may have something to say about the ontology aspect of this.
Well, it's a comment on the analytical techniques, and just as basically also second that, I think that would be a great area to work in. It's also very much cross-disciplinary. There is in the materials, but also to some extent chemicals analytical area. There was a CEN workshop agreement on characterization terminologies and how do you describe in the most generic way, from nanoindentation to Raman spectroscopy, ways of characterizing materials and chemicals. And there is now a phase in a number of projects of applying that, which is where the problems, of course, then start, or where there's a lot of work to be done in terms of more technique specific detailing of that. But I think it's a great area to work in to see on commonalities.
Thank you. Go.
Just to highlight some work that's happened, Heiko mentioned the Expands project. So another thread of work with that was to start to build an ontology of techniques supported at synchrons and neutrons. So there's an ontology called PANET, which is meant to start after that. So that's something we should put into that.
Thank you. Oh, Kirsten.
Yeah, I'm going to move.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'm going to move the microphone over, but I'm also going to make a comment as I walk here, and that is that there are some, to Stephen's question, there are some ontologies out there that address this. I developed one a few years ago, but it probably needs an update. So maybe that's something I need to work on.
I wanted to respond to what Kirsten said earlier about samples. That is an area that we're very interested in. And I'm responding from the perspective of the World Fair project. We really do want to look to do some concerted work with some of the use case or the case studies in World Fair on samples, on specimens, on collections, on artifacts, and to examine how we model the metadata that's needed to understand these objects or datums or whatever it is that we are, and that's important. I also want to reiterate, again, from a World Fair perspective, some of you were at the CDIF, the World Fair CDIF, which is Cross-Domain Interoperability Framework workshop on Monday. A lot of the things that have come up have chimed with our thinking about that. The provenance and process thing, we really want to understand how you're modeling that and how you're making that actionable. I'll say it again, that list of interoperability interfaces, every domain and subdomain should be thinking about that and producing that list. I'd really like to know more about the data models and the terminologies involved as well, because those are another key component, as is that assessment, the fitness for purpose. So there's a little checklist there, which corresponds very much to the checklist that we're developing in CEDA. That already sounds a lot. So I'm going to close this by saying I'm instinctively suspicious of the term minimal metadata. Because if it's a Trojan horse, if it's a term that can kid people on, that you can have a list and you can get them to provide the metadata, then great. But I remember being slapped down once in a naive about 10 years ago or so by John Rumble, the former president of CoData, when I think I accidentally used that term. And he said, Simon, data is difficult. And I think sometimes we have to remember that. There's a huge amount of information there that needs to be gathered. And that minimal is going to be damn big. And we've got to accept that if we want the data to be reusable, to be reproducible, and to be robust. And sometimes I think the term minimal metadata encourages not to face up to that.
Thank you.
Rant over.
I see some hands starting to go up. Kirsty.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly to this idea of working on the ontologies, on the vocabularies. I would also like to take one more step there and say, can we then create catalogs of for which methods or so there is already a standard, or
Right.
what standards there are, and are they machine readable? Is
Sure.
there some? I would love to be able to go somewhere and say, oh, I have this, I can use that. The same, I think, is for samples. There are so many communities that have worked already on metadata standards for samples, just showing to everybody what's out there. So that, I think, could be a task for a working group to actually create these catalogs of existing standards and best practices, if you want to call it that.
Okay.
I just wanted also to address the aspect of machine readable and human, or the user and the producer of these data sets dealing with chemical substances. I think IDOPT tried really to do this. I'm not sure if it is usable in this community, but I think what you need is not only vocabularies, building all up this terminology, but you need also a syntax, and that's also not metadata. That's a syntax expressing how the things relate to each other, so that it becomes machine actionable and readable. But humans will not be touched with it. So they can get more information, but it's not only important to get one term. You need also much more behind. And that's what IDOPT tries to do. And I think it's important that we do something like that also here. Not sure if IDOPT works, but something like that.
Thank you. Felix, then we'll go to Leah, and then we'll probably, you got your one as well. Okay, go Felix.
Yes, from the perspective of someone who's developing infrastructure for the users. So how can we build an easy input form? So I'm coming back to the critic of the minimum information from Simon. So there have to be some required fields, and there have to be optional fields, because the users won't just input lots of data. So they take some time, but not hours or days to fill these fields. Yeah. And how can we decide? So, of course, we want to train them to fill as much metadata as we can get from them. And we try to foster that by telling them use electronic lab notebooks, because then you can automate all these metadata collection. You don't have to put them in a text-based form. But if they have to do that, if they have to fill such a metadata input form, there are of course also ways how we can make it easier. For example, in Radar, we implemented something that is sort of a type ahead. So you type something, if you type a term, you get a list of terms from different terminologies. So that can help a lot, I think. But the question is, so how can we fill the list? So it's always up to date, and it's exactly what the users need.
So I think that's a very good, some good points there. And I think there's something that occurred to me in the earlier talks is that I think it's there in NFDI for Chem at both ends. It's kind of like that vision that ultimately all this should be coming off machines. So actually you don't need to rely on the user to type. At the same time, we've got that pressure, maybe through guidelines and publications, to start getting some stuff that's not otherwise there. And I think there's scope to sort of approach it from both ends. Leah, do you want to raise your point?
Yes, I do. Thanks. This has been fabulous. Thank you so much, everybody. I think I also wanted to consider, if as we're collecting use cases for reuse of data from all these different perspectives, domains of chemistry and other domains, maybe a layer of analysis on that could be what is what's needed for interoperability, what is meant by that. How deep does it need to go into the nuance around samples and chemicals? And this might help us understand, maybe where there are some broader commonalities, and maybe where there are, maybe there's an idea for a layered approach about how deep you need to go. But I do hear this word interoperability tossed up around a lot. And, from my perspective, what it takes to interpret a sample, the chemical nature of a sample is a lot. I agree with John Rumble on that. Even more in the case of materials and real world samples, like you'd see in the geological sciences, for example. But so I think as we think about these different use cases, what do we need to consider for interoperability, and how does that impact how we structure and expose the metadata? So and then the last thing, I wanted to talk about chemical systems too, but I think that might be beyond the scope of this discussion. But I did just want to make the point that there's samples are chemical systems. They're always going to be chemical systems. And so I think that's another thing that IUPAC might be exploring too, is a model for chemical systems that are behind those samples.
Okay, thank you. Over there, yeah.
Yeah, just a short statement again about these methods and the ontologies and the Punnett ontology Brian mentioned. So the ontology has been created because we needed like some kind of a hierarchical search, and so that you can get to one method from various entry points. And I think that might be applicable also to other research areas. And somewhere in summer, I haven't fixed the date yet, but we want to have another like video Zoom meeting about whether this Punnett ontology will be introduced. So if someone is interested, I don't know where it will be on the website there, or you let me know.
Okay,
so
we'll make contact. So we've got on. I'm just going to display. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Wanted to just. If you take the mic around to Alex, I think this is your copy break, by the way. Sorry, microphone. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Promised that we'd introduce Pedro, who couldn't be here because he had to go and get his flight, but he is the RDA EOS Future Ambassador for Catalysis. He's interested as well in chemistry and around. You can read on the slide what his activities are. Alex.
Yeah, I was going to say something about these ontologies and creating more working groups, etc. It sounds like more work, right? and nobody has time. So what is? I read a little bit in these books. They're nice. The gold title is very enticing, right? And I think terminologies that are or no methods that are partly described in the book, and is a combination of all the descriptions in those books actually a description or an ontology or of a method. I'm just thinking, can we combine what's already out there and use that to actually support our needs?
And by books, you're referring to the IU pack sort of terminologies in that context.
Yes, very much.
I think that's good. I don't know, Leah, if you've got any, or Stuart, even as technical editor of the Gold Book, maybe.
I think the fact that there is a 3,000 concept update of the Orange Book, which is about analytical chemistry specifically, that's possibly going to have a few terms in it that will be useful.
Yeah.
We apparently need to get it up yesterday for everybody. So.
Yeah, and Steve and Richard has commented that having a good set of text definitions for concept is a starting point for a formal ontology. So we have that sort of foundation, which is great. Leah, would you like to make any final comments before we wrap up?
Just what are you gonna? What's our next steps here? Are there? Do we want to distill out a couple of ideas for working groups? It'd be great to have some concrete outputs to support the community on what we could do together.
So, I mean, I have lots of scribbles. I think obviously the use cases concept has come up, and I think there's two ways we can think about that. There's the discoverability piece, and then there's specifically the interoperability piece. There's something we could think about how we tap into existing stuff that's going on around samples and build on work going on there. And then I think the other thing that maybe comes to mind is the work around analytical techniques and how you mark those up and what have you. Are there other things that people have heard that we should be having at the top of the list? Yeah. You'll need a microphone.
Yeah, I can't hear that. Could you repeat?
Well, maybe I should leave to go up, but the discussions yesterday in the interoperability around materials ontologies, yes, we were touching on quite a lot of similar themes, and I think there may be some coordination about different working groups were there and how they might interact and how they might tackle different problems.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else? If not, I will thank Stuart, who's been running around with the microphone and helped myself and Leah pull this session together. So thank you to Leah. Thank you to all the speakers who took part. Thank you to everybody online who's engaged. And thank you to you in the room for really useful and helpful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for all these amazing use cases and case studies. This is just so exciting to see infrastructure coming together to support chemical information. Have a great trip back.
Thanks all. Bye. Have a nice conference. Bye.